She watched the bulldozer tear through her late mother's home while her husband stood beside his mistress, smiling. The whole street expected her to break. She didn't. She just stood in silence and nodded once to herself. By morning, he'd wish he had never touched that house. The morning the bulldozer came, the sky over Marlowe Street was the color of old ash. It hung low and gray, like it too had come to mourn something. Amira Carter stood at the edge of the cracked sidewalk with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She did not drink it. She did not even look at it. She only watched. Across the small patch of grass her mother had kept green for over 30 years, a yellow machine lowered its long arm and bit into the front porch like the wood was made of paper. The wood cracked. The railing her mother used to lean on every evening, the one where she would sit and wave to neighbors and hum old church songs under her breath, snapped clean in half and dropped into the dirt. Amira did not move. She did not blink. Behind the machine stood her husband, Marcus. He wore a crisp white shirt and dark glasses, even though the sun was hidden, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he believes he has finally won something he was always owed. He had his hands on his hips. He looked like a king surveying land he had conquered. Beside him stood a woman Amira knew of, but had never been introduced to. Her name was Daphne. She wore a hard hat tipped back on her head like a costume, like a child playing dress-up on a movie set. And in her arms, she cradled a roll of blueprints, pressed to her chest like a newborn, like a trophy. The neighbors had come out onto their steps. Some held their robes closed against the morning cold. Miss Dolores, from 2 doors down, had her hand pressed flat against her mouth. The Tucker family stood in a row on their porch, the children peeking from behind their mother's legs. They looked at the house. They looked at Marcus. Then they looked at Amira. They were waiting. Everyone on Marlowe Street knew what that house meant to her. They had watched her grow up in it. They had watched her mother, Ruth, sweep that porch every single morning. They had eaten Ruth's cornbread and sat in her kitchen during hard winters. So they waited for Amira to run forward. They waited for her to scream, to fall to her knees, to throw her body in front of that machine and beg them to stop. She didn't. "It's just an old house," Marcus called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear him. He spread his arms wide like a preacher. "We're putting this land to better use, something modern, something that actually means something. Time to stop living in the past." Daphne laughed softly beside him, a small, private laugh, and shifted the blueprints in her arms. Amira felt the words land on her like cold rain down the back of her neck, but her face did not change, not one muscle. She looked at the house where she had learned to walk, where she had taken her first steps across a warped wooden floor while her mother clapped and cried. She looked at the window of the back room, the room where her mother had spent her last days, the room where Ruth had held Amira's hand in the dark and whispered, with the little breath she had left, that everything was going to be all right. That window was already gone, swallowed by the machine, just a ragged hole now, breathing dust. And then there was the third one. Marcus's sister, Renee, stepped out from behind a parked work truck. She was holding a clipboard against her chest, and around her neck hung a lanyard with a laminated card that read, in bold black letters, "Family Representative." She would not look at Amira. Her eyes stayed down, fixed on the clipboard like it held the secrets of the universe. Renee had signed the papers. Weeks ago, while Amira was 3 states away caring for a dying friend, Renee had walked into a county office and put her signature on a line that said, The family agreed to let this house come down. She had done it quietly. She had done it without a single phone call to Amira. She had smiled at the clerk and called herself family. Marcus was not finished. He liked an audience, and he had one. He reached over and took the roll of blueprints from Daphne's arms, and he unrolled them right there in the open, holding them up high so the neighbors could see the bright drawing of the mansion that was coming. 6 bedrooms, he announced, tapping the paper with one finger. A pool out back, a real kitchen, marble all through it. This is what the future looks like, people. This is what happens when a man stops apologizing for wanting more. He let his eyes settle on Amira, just for a beat. Some folks build their whole life around a ghost and a few rotten boards. Not me. A few people in the crowd looked at their feet. The cruelty of it, saying that over the wreckage of a dead woman's home, with that dead woman's daughter standing 10 feet away, was almost too much to watch. But Marcus only smiled wider, mistaking the silence for awe. Daphne leaned into him and murmured something, and they both laughed, soft and private, like the whole street was a stage built just for the two of them. Husband, outsider, blood. 3 blades, all turned at once, all pointed at the same soft and secret place in Amira's chest. The neighbors began to murmur. It started low, like wind through dry leaves. Miss Dolores shook her head slowly and whispered, "Lord, have mercy, that poor child." An old man across the street, Mr. Beaumont, took off his hat and held it over his heart, the way men do at funerals. They felt the shame for Amira. They carried it for her because she would not carry it herself. She just stood there, straight-backed, still as a photograph. After a long moment, Amira set her cold coffee down on the low brick wall at the edge of the yard. She did it gently, carefully. Then she walked, slow and steady, across the dead grass toward the wreckage of the porch. Marcus watched her come. His smile flickered just for a second. He did not understand what she was doing, and for the first time that morning, something uncertain crossed his face. "Amira," he said, his voice losing some of its performance. "Stay back. It's dangerous." She did not answer him. She did not even look at him. She reached the edge of the rubble. She crouched down among the splintered wood and the gray dust, the way a mother crouches beside a sleeping child. Something small had caught the weak gray light, half buried near what used to be the doorstep. She reached out and picked it up. It was a brass tag, dull, scratched, worn smooth at the edges, about the size of a key ring. She turned it over once in her fingers, and the metal was cold and impossibly familiar in her palm. She closed her hand around it. Then she stood up. Slowly. She looked at the machine, its arm hanging in the air. She looked at the operator, who had paused, unsure. She looked at her husband and at the woman standing so close beside him, and Amira nodded. Once, to herself, like a woman confirming the answer to a question she had carried for a very long time. The neighbors did not understand it. Marcus did not understand it. Daphne rolled her eyes and turned away to point at something on the blueprints. But that single, silent nod was the first crack in a story that none of them could see yet. A crack running underneath everything they thought they knew. Because by the next morning, Marcus would wish, with everything in him, that he had never touched that house. To understand the nod, you have to understand the house. And to understand the house, you have to go all the way back to a time before Marcus, before Daphne, before any of them. Amira grew up inside those 4 small rooms. Her mother, Ruth, raised her there alone, with no husband and no help. working herself down to the bone and sleeping very little. In the daytime, Ruth cooked in a school cafeteria, standing over hot steel trays, feeding other people's children with a smile. And at night, when most of the city was asleep, Ruth cleaned the offices of a large construction company on the other side of town. She pushed a cart down long, silent hallways, emptying trash cans and wiping down desks that cost more than she made in a month. Sometimes, when there was no one to watch her, little Amira came along on those night shifts. She would sit in a big leather chair in an empty corner office, swinging her legs because they did not reach the floor while her mother worked. And Ruth, dusting the long, polished table where important men signed important deals, would say the same thing to her daughter, again and again, like a prayer she wanted the child to memorize. "You see all this, baby?" she would say, sweeping her rag across the gleaming wood. "Big chairs, big windows, big talk. But let me tell you something, and don't you ever forget it. It is not the loud man who really owns a thing. It is the name on the paper. A name on paper outlives a loud mouth every single time. You remember that." When Ruth finally left that job, worn down and proud, she kept one small thing: a brass tag from the company key ring, the kind they gave the night staff so they could lock up after themselves. She kept it in a little dish by the front door of the house on Marlowe Street. To anyone else it was nothing, a scrap of metal. But to Ruth, it meant she had been trusted with the keys to a place that thought it was better than her. That brass tag was the very same one Amira now held tight in her fist, pulled from the dust of the broken porch. Ruth had been a gentle woman. She gave plates of food to neighbors who had none, even when her own cupboards were near empty. She never raised her voice, not even when life gave her every reason in the world to scream. She taught her daughter that softness was not the same as weakness, that patience was a quiet kind of strength most people were too loud and too rushed to ever learn. That was the past, warm, poor, honest, and full of love. The present was cold, and it was standing in the front yard in dark glasses, smiling, holding a roll of blueprints for a mansion to be built on the bones of all those memories. The betrayal did not stop when the dust settled. It only grew bigger, and it grew bolder. Within days, Marcus moved Daphne into a rented house across town. It was the kind of place he had always talked about wanting, with tall windows and a stone fountain bubbling in the front yard. He did not hide it anymore. He did not even try. He came back to the apartment he shared with Amira only to collect things: his suits, his good shoes, the expensive watch he wore to feel like somebody. And he spoke to his wife like she was a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. "You should be happy for me," he said one evening, zipping up a leather bag. He paused at the door and looked at her, and for a moment he almost seemed to believe his own words. "I gave us 9 years of small, Amira. 9 years of this little apartment and your sad little memories and never reaching for anything. I wanted a better life, a real one. Is that a crime? You were always content to stay down here in the dirt. I wasn't. One of us had to want more." He shouldered the bag. "I'm finally building something real, something people will respect. You'll understand one day." What he was building was a mansion for another woman on the land where Amira's mother had died. And to build it, he was burning through every dollar they had saved together across 9 years of marriage. Amira watched the accounts quietly from the small kitchen table in her apartment, under the light of a single lamp. She saw the money leave in great rushing waves, and she saw what was left behind grow smaller and smaller. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday, slid under her door by a courier who did not wait. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by Marcus, and a second notice telling her that the apartment lease was in his name alone, and that she had until the end of the month to find somewhere else to go. That night, Amira broke. She sat down on the floor of the little apartment, with the papers scattered around her, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry since her mother died. Deep, shaking sobs that came up from somewhere old and buried. No husband, no home, no mother's house to run back to. Everything she had ever called hers was being pulled out from under her at once, and for one long hour in the dark, she let herself feel every bit of it. She pressed the brass tag to her chest and rocked and wept until there was nothing left. And then, slowly, she stopped. She wiped her face. She picked the papers up off the floor and stacked them neatly. Something in her had been emptied out, and something harder had moved in to take its place. But Marcus did not see a home when he closed his eyes. He saw a monument to himself, with his name carved over the door. His sister, Renee, kept the fire burning. She had Marcus's ear, and she filled it with poison at every meal, telling him Amira was bitter, jealous, broke, that she had always been holding him back. "Let her sit alone in her sadness," Renee said one night. "You don't owe her a thing." But it was Daphne who enjoyed it the most. One afternoon, she found Amira in a home and hardware showroom, quietly looking at floor tiles, and she walked straight over, close enough that other shoppers stopped to watch. "Picking out tiles for a house you don't even have?" Daphne said, her voice dripping sweet as syrup. "Oh, honey, that's just sad. Marcus told me you were always the type to hold on tight to things long after they stopped wanting you around." Amira did not flinch. She set the tile sample down, gently, the way her mother used to set down a good plate she could not afford to break. Then she turned and walked out with her back perfectly straight. To everyone who saw it, she looked beaten, numb, hollowed out, broken at last, after all of it. That was exactly what Amira wanted every last one of them to believe. There was one more cut to come, and it was the deepest. A week after the showroom, Marcus sent her a single text message with no warning and no softness in it. It was a photograph of the cleared lot, scraped flat and empty where her mother's house had stood. Underneath it, he had written 4 words: "Out with the old." Amira sat alone in her kitchen and looked at that picture for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the table, and she picked up the brass tag instead, and she held it until her hand stopped shaking. Grief and resolve, it turned out, could live in the very same breath, because in the quiet of her small apartment, late at night when the city had gone still, Amira was not only grieving. In the dark, after the tears dried, she would sit at her kitchen table and hold the brass tag in her hand, turning it slowly, over and over, with her thumb, and something in her face would go still and certain, the way her mother's used to. She made no speeches, she told no one. She simply waited and prepared, in a way no one around her could see. Marcus thought his wife had nothing. He thought she was empty. He had never, not one single time in 9 years of marriage, truly asked her about her work, about the long hours she kept, about the people she met when she left in the morning. He had never asked because he had never once believed that his wife was capable of doing anything that truly mattered. And that, more than anything, was the thing he had gotten most wrong. Her mother had whispered it to her in the dark of borrowed offices, and now Amira was getting ready to teach her husband exactly what it meant. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony, the gray clouds finally broke apart, and the sun came out strong and bright. Marcus took it as a sign that the universe was smiling on him. He had spared no expense. On the cleared lot where Amira's mother's house had stood for half a century, he had erected a large white tent, the kind they put up for weddings. The rubble was all gone now, hauled away. The ground had been scraped flat and smooth, naked and waiting. He had invited investors, serious men in fine suits who had agreed, on the strength of his big talk, to put real money into a whole row of luxury homes. Daphne's mansion was to be the first one, the shining example, the proof that Marcus Carter was a man who made things happen. There was a small raised stage at the front. On it sat a polished silver shovel resting on a wooden stand, its handle wrapped in a blue ribbon, ready for the ceremonial first dig into the earth. Daphne wore a long, flowing cream dress and stood near the very front, smiling and touching people's arms, acting for all the world like the queen of a country she had just been handed. Renee moved through the small crowd with her ever-present clipboard, playing the host, handing out little printed cards that showed bright, hopeful drawings of the future homes. Marcus stepped up to a microphone and tapped it twice. The crowd quieted. He thanked the investors for their faith. He spoke about vision. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about having the courage to tear down the old to make way for the new. Some people in this life, he said, and here he paused and let his gaze drift toward the back of the gathering. Some people will only ever want to keep you small. They will hold on to the past with both hands and try to drag you down into it. But not me. A real man builds. A real man rises. And today, we rise. There was warm applause. Daphne beamed. He did not see the car that had just pulled up to the curb behind the tent. He did not see its door open. Amira stepped out. She did not look broken. She did not look numb. She wore a dark, sharply tailored suit, the very kind those loud and important men used to wear in the offices her mother cleaned at night. Her hair was pulled back, clean and severe. Her face was perfectly calm, smooth as still water. In one hand, she carried a slim leather folder. She began to walk toward the tent, unhurried, each step certain. And as she came, one by one, the guests turned to look at her. The applause died down into a confused quiet. Heads tilted. People who had been smiling were now simply staring. Marcus saw her, and his jaw went tight. He forced out a laugh into the microphone, but it came out thin. "Amira," he said, "this here is a private event. I know all this must be hard for you. I know it's hard to let go of the past, but this really isn't the time or the—" "I'm not here to let go," Amira said. Her voice was not loud. She did not need it to be, but it carried across that whole silent lot, clear as a bell. And the crowd went still in a way that was different from before. Not a sudden gasp, not a dramatic hush. It was slower than that. It was the feeling of people standing on a floor and slowly realizing the boards beneath their feet were not nearly as solid as they had believed. Amira walked, calm and steady, all the way to the front of the tent. But the calm cost her more than anyone could see. As she passed the spot where her mother's porch had once stood, where the railing used to be, her chest tightened and her eyes stung hot, and for one terrible second she felt the whole grief rise up in her throat and nearly buckle her knees. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fall down in that dirt and weep for her mother and her home and her marriage all at once. She let herself feel it, fully, for the length of a single breath. Then she pushed it back down, deep, where it could wait. She climbed the edge of the small stage, and when she turned to face the crowd, her face was perfectly still again. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, with a small, polite nod. "My name is Amira Carter, and I believe that before any of you put one more dollar into this man's project, you have a right to know exactly who it is you are doing business with." One of the investors, an older man with silver at his temples and sharp, careful eyes, leaned forward in his chair. He was listening now. They all were. Amira opened the slim leather folder in her hands. "The construction firm that Marcus hired," she said, "the one that tore down the house that stood on this very spot, and the one he has promised, will build all of these grand new homes. It is called Cornerstone Build Group. He is very proud of his relationship with that company. I have heard he brags, at dinners just like the ones that brought you all here, about being their single biggest client." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But in all his bragging, he never once bothered to find out who actually owns it." She drew a single crisp page from the folder and set it down flat on the polished stage, turning it so the letterhead faced the crowd, where the silver-haired man and the others could lean in and read it for themselves. "I do," Amira said. Marcus actually laughed. Just once, a short, nervous laugh. Then he looked down at the document in her hand. The laugh died instantly. "I own it," Amira continued, her voice calm and steady. "Cornerstone Build Group belongs to me. I built it quietly, contract by contract, year after year, while you were too busy looking past me to ever notice. Every crew standing on this lot, every machine behind you, every permit pinned to that fence, every dollar tied to this project, it all runs through my company." She paused and finally looked directly at her husband. "The men who tore down my mother's house work for me, Marcus." His face drained of color. Amira's eyes never left his. They just didn't know whose mother it was. For one long, ringing moment, not a single soul in that tent drew breath. Marcus's mouth fell open, but no sound came out of it. His mind was racing backward through every dinner, every handshake, every time he had stood in a room full of important men and dropped the name Cornerstone like it was a card he was proud to hold. He thought of all the nights Amira had come home late and tired, and how he had never once asked her why. He had built his whole rising image on the back of a company, and the company had been hers the entire time. He had been a guest in his own wife's house and never even known it. The smile was gone, wiped clean off his face as if it had never been there. The powerful firm he had bragged about for months, the company that made him feel like a giant among men, the source of all his big talk, belonged entirely to the wife he had called nothing. The wife he had called broke. The wife whose mother's home he had crushed into dust to impress another woman. Daphne's face had gone gray. The blueprints suddenly hung loose and forgotten at her side. A low murmur began to move through the investors, men leaning toward one another, a few of them already reaching for their phones. The silver-haired man simply sat back in his chair and folded his arms, watching Marcus the way a man watches a building he has decided not to buy. Amira did not raise her voice. She did not point a finger. She did not gloat. She simply turned, with that same terrible calm, to a tall man standing quietly at the edge of the lot near the idle machines. He was the site foreman, and the moment Amira had stepped onto that stage, he had quietly taken the hard hat off his head and held it against his chest. "Mr. Adebayo," she said, and her voice was kind now, warm even. "Thank you for all your hard work these past weeks. I know it wasn't easy. You can stand the crew down now. We're finished here." "Yes, ma'am," the foreman said. He gave her a small, respectful nod, and all across the lot, one engine after another fell silent until the only sound left under that white tent was the soft snapping of the canvas in the wind. The fall came fast, and the remarkable thing was how little Amira had to push. Cornerstone Build Group held every contract that mattered on Marcus's grand project. It held the demolition permits, the building permits, the bonded license required to do any major work in that whole district. And by the very next morning, every one of those contracts had been quietly frozen. The row of luxury homes that Marcus had promised his investors simply could not be built, because the only firm with the legal right and the crews to build them belonged to Amira. And Amira was not lending her name or her company to a single brick of it. The investors pulled out before lunch. The serious men who had shaken Marcus's hand just the day before, who had called him a visionary and a man on the rise, now would not return a single one of his frantic phone calls. The older man with the silver hair was the only one who bothered to say anything to his face. He found Marcus standing dazed in the parking lot of his own dead dream, and he stopped beside him just long enough to speak. "Son," the old man said, not unkindly, "you stood up there, and you sold all of us shares in a company you don't own. You looked us in the eye and did it." He shook his head slowly. "We don't do business with men like that. We never will." Then he got into his car and drove away, and he never looked back. Daphne was humiliated in front of them all before she even left. As the truth landed and the investors began to rise from their seats, one of them, the silver-haired man, looked her up and down in her long cream dress and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "And who is this? The decorator?" The crowd laughed, a sharp and ugly sound, and Daphne's face burned red. The blueprints she had cradled like a crown slipped from her hands and unrolled across the dirt, and no one moved to pick them up. She stood there, exposed, just another woman who had bet everything on a man with empty pockets and a borrowed name. She had never loved Marcus. Not really. She had loved the rising man, the big project, the promise of a mansion with her name on the deed. The moment she understood the project was dead, she went back to the rented house with the fountain, packed her things in a single afternoon, and left. But this time there was no soft landing for her. Word of the ceremony spread fast. The friends she had bragged to stopped answering. The man whose money she had counted on was ruined. She left Marcus a short message that said only, "This isn't what I signed up for. Don't call me." Then she vanished, with nothing to show for any of it but the story people now told about the woman in the cream dress who got laughed out of a tent. And then there was Renee. The papers she had signed, the ones where she had called herself the family representative, had been formally filed with the county. But Amira's lawyers laid the truth out, plain and cold. Renee had possessed no legal standing whatsoever to authorize the demolition of that property. The house and the land were part of the estate of Ruth Carter, an estate in which Amira was named the sole and only heir. Renee had signed documents she had no earthly right to sign. She had forged a family authority she did not have, and what she had done had a real name in the eyes of the law, and that name was fraud. The same family that had whispered behind Amira's back for years, that had nodded along while Renee called her bitter and jealous, now turned on Renee all at once. The phones began to ring. Aunts who had stayed silent suddenly found their voices. Cousins who had taken Marcus's side without a second thought now wanted nothing to do with the trouble Renee had brought down on all their heads. Renee, who had walked through that ceremony so proud, with her clipboard and her laminated card around her neck, now sat alone at her own kitchen table, facing hard questions from lawyers that she had no good answers for. And Marcus lost all of it. Every last piece. The project was gone. The investors were gone. The reputation in the community that he had humiliated his own wife to build was gone, turned overnight into a story people told and shook their heads at. The men who had called him important stopped taking his calls. The woman he had paraded on his arm had vanished. The sister who had helped him scheme was drowning in troubles of her own. He came to Amira's small apartment one last time, late in the evening. He stood in the doorway, and Amira saw that he looked smaller than she had ever seen a man look. The fine shirt was wrinkled. The dark glasses were gone. His shoulders had caved in on themselves. "Amira," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "You could fix all of this. I know you could. One word from you and those contracts come back. The investors would listen if you just told them. We could still build something. We could start over. You and me." He swallowed hard. "Please, please, Amira?" Amira looked at him for a long, long moment. She stood in the doorway of her quiet apartment, and she held the brass tag in her hand, turning it slowly with her thumb, the way she always did now. She had the power to destroy him completely, and they both knew it. With the full weight of her firm and her lawyers behind her, she could have buried him under lawsuits and crushing debt for the rest of his natural life. She could have taken back, with interest, every dollar he had wasted and every cent he had quietly stolen from their years together. The money alone, the sheer ruin she could rain down, was enough to end him entirely and leave nothing behind. She chose not to. She chose not to. "My mother cleaned offices at night for men like you," Amira said quietly. "Men who thought being loud made them important. Men who believed power came from being seen instead of being earned." She looked at him for a long moment. "She used to tell me something when I was a little girl. I spent 9 years trying to show you what she meant." A sad smile touched her lips. "But you never listened. You were too busy listening to yourself." Marcus lowered his eyes. Amira's voice never changed. "You spent 9 years looking straight through me. Now you'll spend the rest of your life remembering the woman you never bothered to see." She did not raise her voice, not once. She simply, through clean and quiet paperwork drawn up by patient lawyers, took back what had always been hers: the land, the deed to her mother's lot. What remained of the accounts he had not yet managed to drain. All of it returned to its rightful place with the stroke of a pen and the name on the paper. And then Amira gently closed the door. A full year went by, and the seasons turned over Marlowe Street. On that same patch of land where a yellow machine had once torn a home to splinters, a small house stood once again. Amira had rebuilt it herself, through her own firm, with her own crews, exactly as it had been before. The same modest porch, the same wooden railing, sanded and painted fresh, just right for an old woman to lean on during a warm summer evening. The same window in the back room, where the light came in gold and soft in the late afternoon. She had not built a mansion. She had never wanted a mansion. She had built a mansion, never wanted a mansion. She had built a home. The neighbors who had once stood on their steps and watched her public shame now waved to her warmly as she came and went. Miss Dolores baked her a sweet potato pie and carried it over the very first week, and the two of them sat on the new porch and talked until the sun went down. Mr. Beaumont, who had taken off his hat in sorrow on that gray morning, now tipped it to her in plain respect every time she passed. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, Amira stood at the new front door. The sky was soft and going gold at the edges, and the street was peaceful. She reached into her pocket and took out the brass tag, the one her mother had carried home from a job that thought it was so much better than her, the one Amira herself had pulled from the dust and the ruin of everything that broke. She had cleaned it and polished it until it shone. There was a small brass hook set into the door frame beside the door. Amira lifted the tag and hung it there, carefully, where she would see it every single time she came home. Her mother had cleaned the halls of powerful men and come home with nothing but this worn scrap of metal and a single, hard-won lesson. Her daughter had taken that lesson and quietly built a life that no machine could ever tear down. The bulldozer had destroyed her mother's house. It had shattered the porch, the windows, and the walls. But the most valuable thing Ruth Carter ever gave her daughter was never inside that house to begin with. It was the lesson she carried. A year ago, everyone on Marlowe Street thought Amira had lost everything. They were wrong. She had rebuilt the home, reclaimed her future. And while Marcus was still living with the consequences of his choices, Amira finally had something he could never take from her again: peace. Standing on the porch as the evening sun painted the street gold, Amira smiled. A real smile. The same quiet smile her mother used to wear. If Amira's journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. And tell me in the comments, if you were standing on that street watching your mother's home come down, would you have stayed silent, or would you have fought back?